Hello and welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin. Well, first I would like to get address the elephant in the room, and that is this picture quality. My camera, I don't know what the problem is. It just took a dump. What did it take, you ask? A dump. It pooped. It pooped the bed. What are you going to do? So, until I can dismount it and then, I don't know, see what's up. I don't know what the deal is. I'm using my internal one. So, just good thing this is an audio show. But anyway, let's get started, shall we? Chapter 26, Knights and Squires. The chief mate of the Pequod was Starbuck, a native of Nantucket and a Quaker by descent. He was a long, earnest man, and though born on an icy coast, seemed well adapted to endure hot latitudes, his flesh being hard as twice-baked biscuit. Transported to the Indies, his live blood would not spoil like bottled ale. He must have been born in some time of general drought and famine, or upon one of those fast days for which his state is famous. Only some 30 summers had he seen. Those summers had dried up all his physical superfluousness. But this, in thinness, so to speak, seemed no more the token of wasting anxieties and cares than it seemed the indication of any bodily blight. It was merely the condensation of the man. He was by no means ill-looking, quite the contrary. His pure, tight skin was an excellent fit, and closely wrapped up in it and embalmed with inner health and strength, like a revivified Egyptian, this Starbuck seemed prepared to endure for long ages to come, and to endure always, as now, for be it polar snow or torrid sun, like a patent chronometer, his interior vitality was warranted to do well in all climates. Looking into his eaves, you seemed to see the actually that's a typo, I think it's eyes. Looking into his eyes, you seemed to see yet there the lingering images of those thousand-fold perils he had calmly confronted through life. A staid, steadfast man whose life, for the most part, was a telling pantomime of action, and not a tame chapter of sounds. Yet for all his hardy sobriety and fortitude, there were certain qualities in him which at times affected, and in some cases seemed well nigh to overbalance all the rest. Uncommonly conscientious for a seaman, and endued with a deep natural reverence, the wild watery loneliness of his life did therefore strongly incline him to superstition. But to that sort of superstition, which in some organization seems rather to spring somehow from the intelligence than from ignorance. Outward portents and inward presentiments were his, and if at times these things bent the welded iron of his soul, much more did his faraway domestic memories of his young Cape wife and child tend to bend him still more from the original ruggedness of his nature, and open him still further to those latent influences which, in some honest-hearted men, restrain the gush of daredevil daring, so often evinced by others in the more perilous vicissitudes of the fishery. "I will have no man in my boat," said Starbuck, "who is not afraid of a whale." By this he seemed to mean not only that the most reliable and useful courage was that which arises from the fair estimation of the encountered peril, but that an utterly fearless man is a far more dangerous comrade than a coward. "Aye, aye," said Stubb, the second mate. "Starbuck there is a careful a man as you'll find anywhere in this fishery." But we shall ere long see that the word careful precisely means when used by a man like... But we shall ere long see what that word careful precisely means when used by a man like Stubb, or almost any other whale hunter. Starbuck was no crusader after perils. In him, courage was not a sentiment, but a thing simply useful to him, and always at hand upon all mortally practical occasions. Besides, he thought, perhaps that in this business of whaling, courage was one of the great staple outfits of the ship, like her beef and bread, and not to be foolishly wasted. Wherefore he had no fancy for lowering for whales after sundown, nor for persisting in fighting a fish that too much persisted in fighting him. For, thought Starbuck, I am here in this critical ocean to kill whales for my living, and not to be killed by them for theirs. And that hundreds of men had been so killed, Starbuck well knew. What doom was his own father's? Where in bottomless deeps could he find the torn limbs of his brother? With memories like these in him, and moreover given to a certain superstitiousness, as has been said, the courage of this Starbuck, which could nevertheless still flourish, must indeed have been extreme. But it was not in reasonable nature that a man so organized and with such terrible experiences and remembrances as he had. It was not true. It was not in nature that these things should fail in latently engendering an element in him, which, under suitable circumstances, would break out from its confinement and burn all his courage up. And brave as he might be, it was that sort of bravery chiefly, visible in some intrepid men, which, while generally abiding firm in the conflict with seas or winds or whales or any of the ordinary irrational horrors of the world, yet cannot withstand those more terrific, because more spiritual terrors, which sometimes menace you from the concentrating brow of an enraged and mighty man. Because of more spiritual terrors, which sometimes menace you from the concentrating brow of an enraged and mighty man. But were the coming narrative to reveal in any instance the complete abasement of poor Starbuck's fortitude, scarce might I have the heart to write it. But it's a thing most sorrowful, nay, shocking, to expose the fall of valor in the soul. Men may seem detestable as joint stock companies and nations, knaves and fools and murderers there may be. Men may have mean and meager faces, but man in the ideal is so noble and so sparkling, such a grand and glowing creature, that over any ignominious blemish in all. I'm going to double check that because I don't know exactly. Well, I appreciate that, Jenny, while I'm looking up this word. This book, it's a special book because it's a book of poetry. It's a book of philosophy. It's a book of history. It is a time capsule into the whaling past of America, but and the world. There are so many references to classic literature and historical events that, I mean, it's very special. And then the writing is downright Shakespearean. It's a real cool book, and I'm really glad that you're listening to at least part of it. Someone, I was talking to somebody on Instagram today about it, and I was telling them, you gotta try again. She was saying that she had tried before, didn't like it, and put it down. And I don't think there's any shame in that. Like, if you pick up a book, you're like, I'm just not into it, put it aside and come back later. It's a classic. It's been around a very long time. It's not the book, it's you. You know what I mean? And that's okay. I started 3 times and got bogged down. And then I read Nathaniel Philbrick's Why Read Moby Dick, I think is the name of it. And man, I picked it up again, sort of knowing he sort of shows you what to look for. It's just a little pamphlet. And my goodness, now it's one of my favorite books. I've read it. This is my 3rd time. This recording is my 3rd time. Ignominious. I think that's how you say it.
Ignominious.
Yes. See, I told you.
Ignominious.
So we're going to go with. All right, where is that thing? Okay. But man, in the ideal, is so noble and so sparkling, such a grand and glowing creature, that over any ignominious blemish in him all his fellows should run to throw their costliest robes. That immaculate manliness we feel within ourselves, so far within us, that it remains intact, that it remains intact, though all the outer characters seem gone, bleeds with that it remains intact, though all the outer characters seem gone, bleeds with keenest anguish at the undraped spectacle of a valor-ruined man. Nor can piety itself, at such a shameful sight, completely stifle her upbraidings against the permitting stars. But this august dignity I treat of is not the dignity of kings and robes, but that abounding dignity which has no robed investiture. Thou shalt see it shining in the arm that wields a pick or drives a spike. Thou shalt see it shining in the arm that wields a pick or drives a spike. That democratic dignity which, on all hands, radiates without end from God himself. The great God absolute, the center and circumference of all democracy, his omnipresence, our divine equality. If then to meanest mariners and renegades and castaways I shall hereafter ascribe high qualities, though dark, weave around them tragic graces, if even the most mournful, perchance the most abased among them all, shall at times lift himself to the exalted mounts, if I shall touch that workman's arm with some ethereal light, if I shall spread a rainbow over his disastrous set of sun, then against all mortal critics bear me out in it, thou just spirit of equality, which hast spread one royal mantle of humanity over all my kind. Bear me out in it, thou great democratic God, who didst not refuse to the swart convict Bunyan the pale poetic pearl, thou who didst clothe with doubly hammered leaves of finest gold and stumped and poppered arm of old Cervantes. Thou who didst pick up Andrew Jackson from the pedals, thou who didst pick up Andrew Jackson from the pebbles, who didst hurl him upon a war horse, who didst thunder him higher than a throne, thou who in all thy mighty earthly marchings ever cullest thy selectest champions from the kingly commoners, bear me out in it, O God. That was chapter 26. Let me do one. That was 13. Let me do one more. Chapter 27, Knights and Squires. Stubb was the second mate. He was a native of Cape Cod, and hence, according to local usage, was called a Cape Cod man. A happy-go-lucky, neither craven nor valiant, taking perils as they came with an indifferent air, and while engaged in the most imminent crisis of the chase, toiling away, calm and collected as a journeyman joiner engaged for the year. Good-humored, easy, and careless, he presided over his whaleboat as if the most deadly encounter were but a dinner, and his crew all invited guests. He was as particular about the comfortable arrangements of his part of the boat as an old stage driver is about the snugness of his box. When close to the whale, in the very deathlock of the fight, he handled his unpitying lance coolly and offhandedly, as a whistling tinker his hammer. He would hum over his old rig-a-dig tunes. While flank and flank with a most exasperated monster. Long usage had, for this Stubb, converted the jaws of death into an easy chair. What he thought of death itself, there's no telling. Whether he thought of it at all might be a question. But if he ever did chance to cast his mind that way after a comfortable dinner, no doubt, like a good sailor, he took it to be a sort of call of the watch to tumble aloft and bestir themselves there about something which he would find out when he obeyed the order, and not sooner. What perhaps with other things made Stubbs such an easygoing, unfearing man, so cheerily trudging off with the burden of life in a world of fail and so cheerily trudging off with the burden of life in a world full of grave peddlers, in a world fail of grave peddlers, all bowed to the ground with their packs. What helped to bring about that almost impious good humor of his? That thing must have been his pipe. For, like his nose, his short, black little pipe was one of the regular features of his face. You would almost as soon have expected him to turn out of his bunk without his nose as without his pipe. He kept a whole row of pipes there, ready loaded, stuck in a rack within easy reach of his hand. And whenever he turned in, he he smoked them all out in succession, lighting one from the other to the end of the chapter, then loading them again to be in readiness anew. For when Stubb dressed, instead of first putting his legs into his trousers, he put his pipe into his mouth. I say this continual smoking must have been one cause, at least, of his peculiar disposition. For everyone knows that his early air, whether ashore or afloat, is terribly infected with the nameless miseries of the numberless mortals who have died exhaling it. And as in time of the cholera, some people go about with a camphorated handkerchief to their mouths, so likewise, against all mortal tribulations, Stubbs' tobacco smoke might have operated as a sort of disinfecting agent. The third mate was Flask, a native of Tisbury and Martha's Vineyard, a short, stout, ruddy young fellow, very pugnacious concerning whales, who somehow seemed to think that the great Leviathans had personally and hereditarily affronted him, and therefore it was a sort of point of honor to him to destroy them whenever encountered. So utterly lost was he to all sense of reverence for the many marvels of their majestic bulk and mystic ways, and so dead to anything like an apprehension of any possible danger encountering them, that in his poor opinion the wondrous whale was but a species of magnified mouse, or at least a water rat, requiring only a little circumvention and some small application of time and trouble in order to kill and boil. This ignorant, unconscious fearlessness of his made him a little waggish in the matter of whales. He followed these fish for the fun of it, and a 3 years' voyage round Cape Horn was only a jolly joke that lasted that length of time. As a carpenter's nails are divided into wrought nails and cut nails, so mankind may be similarly divided. Little Flask was one of the wrought ones, made to clinch tight and last long. They called him King Post on board of the Pequod, because in form he could be well likened to the short, square timber known by that name in Arctic whalers, and which by means of many radiating side timbers inserted into it, serves to brace the ship against the icy concussions of those battering seas. Now these three mates, Starbuck, Stubb, and Flask, were momentous men. They was who by universal prescription commanded 3 of the Pequod's boats as headsmen. In that grand order of battle, in which Captain Ahab would probably marshal his forces to descend upon the whales, these 3 headsmen were as captains of companies, or being armed with their long, keen whaling spears, they were as a picked trio of lancers, even as the harpooners were flingers of javelins. And since in this famous fishery each mate or headsman, like a Gothic knight of old, is always accompanied by his boat steerer or harpooner, who in certain conjunctures provides him with a fresh lance when the former one has been badly twisted or elbowed in the assault, and moreover, as there generally subsists between the two a close intimacy and friendliness, it is therefore but meet that in this place we set down who the Pequod's harpooners were, and to what headsman each of them belonged. First of all was Queequeg, whom Starbuck, the chief mate, had selected for his squire, but Queequeg's already known. Next was Tashtego, an unmixed Indian from Gayhead, the most westerly promontory of Martha's Vineyard, which there still exists the last remnants of a village of red men, which has long supplied the neighboring island of Nantucket with many of her most daring harpooners. In the fishery, they usually go by the generic name of Gayheaders. Tashtego's long, lean, sable hair, his high cheekbones and black rounding eyes for an Indian, oriental in their largeness but Antarctic in their glittering expression, all this sufficiently proclaimed him an inheritor of the unviviated blood of those proud warrior hunters, who, in quest of the great New England moose, had scoured, bow in hand, the aboriginal forests of the Maine. But no longer snuffing in the trail of the wild beasts of the woodland, Tashtego now hunted in the wake of the great whales of the sea, the unerring harpoon of the sun fitly replacing the infallible arrow of the sires. To look at the tawny brown of his lithe, snaky limbs, you would almost have credited the superstitions of some of the early Puritans and half believed this wild Indian to be a son of a prince of the powers of the air. Tashtego was Stubb, the second mate's squire. Third among the harpooners was Daggoo, a gigantic, coal-black Negro savage with a lion-like tread and a Ahasuerus to behold. Suspended from his ears were two golden hoops, so large that the sailors called them ring bolts and would talk of securing the topsail halyards to him. In his youth, Daggoo had voluntarily shipped on board of a whaler, lying in a lonely bay on his native coast, and never having been anywhere in the world but in Africa, Nantucket, and the pagan harbors most frequented by the whalemen, and having now led for many years the bold life of the fishery in the ships of owners uncommonly heedful of what manner of men they shipped, Daggoo retained all his barbaric virtues, and, erect as a giraffe, moved about the docks in all the pomp of 6'5" in his socks. There was a corporeal humility in looking up at him. There was a corporeal humility in looking up at him, and a white man standing before him seemed a white flag to come beg truce of a fortress. Curious to tell, this imperial Negro, Ahasuerus Daggoo, was the squire of Little Flask, who looked like a chessman beside him. As for the residue of the Pequod's company, be it said that at the present day, not 1 in 2 of the many thousand men before the mast employed in the American whale fishery are American-born, though pretty nearly all the officers are. Herein it is the same with the American whale fishery as with the American Navy and military and merchant navies, and the engineering forces employed in the construction of the American canals and railroads. The same, I say, because in all these cases, the Native American literally provides the brains, the rest of the world is generally supplying the muscles. No small number of these whaling seamen belong in the Azores, where the outward-bound Nantucket whaler frequently touch to augment their crews from the hardy peasants of these rocky shores. In like manner, the Greenland whalers sailing out of Hull or London put in at the Shetland Islands to receive the full complement of their crew. Upon the passage homewards, they drop them there again. How it is, there's no telling, but islanders seem to make the best whalemen. They are nearly all islanders in the Pequod. They were nearly all islanders in the Pequod. Isolados, too, I shall call such, not acknowledging the common continent of men, but each isolado living in a separate continent of his own. Yet now, federated along one keel, what a set of these isolados were. An Anacharsis Kloot's deputation from all the isles of the sea and all the ends of the earth, accompanying old Ahab in the Pequod, to lay the world's grievances before that bar from which not very many of them ever come back. Black little Pip, he never did. Oh no, he went before. Poor Alabama boy, on the grim Pequod's forecastle, he shall ere long see him, beating his tambourine, prelusive of the eternal time when sent for to the great quarter-deck on high. He was bid strike in with angels and beat his tambourine in glory, called a coward here, hailed a hero there. End of chapter 27. Ooh, chapter 28. This is the one where you finally meet Ahab. I think we'll do this one. Chapter 28. Ahab. For several days after leaving Nantucket, nothing above hatches was seen of Captain Ahab. The mates regularly relieved each other at the watches, and for aught that could be seen to the contrary, they seemed to be the only commanders of the ship. Only they sometimes issued from the cabin with orders so sudden and peremptory that after all it was plain that they but commanded vicariously. Yet their supreme lord and dictator was there, though hitherto unseen by any eyes not permitted to penetrate into the now sacred retreat of the cabin. I've just realized I have gone this whole time without so much as any sort of liquid on my lips and my tongue. Okay. Every time I ascended to the deck from my watches below, I instantly gazed aft to mark if any strange face was visible. For my first vague disquietude touching the unknown captain, now in the seclusion of the sea, became almost a perturbation. Perturbation. I don't know. I'm going to look that one up. That one's one I have trouble with. Perturbation. Now in the seclusion of the sea became almost a perturbation. This was strangely heightened at times by the ragged Elijah's diabolical incoherences uninvitedly recurring to me with a subtle energy I could not have been before conceived of. But poorly could I withstand them. Much as in other moods, I was almost ready to smile at the solemn whimsicalities of that outlandish prophet of the wharves. But whatever it was of apprehensiveness or uneasiness, to call it so, which I felt, yet whenever I came to look about me in the ship, it seemed against all warranty to cherish such emotions. For though the harpooners, with the great body of the crew, were a far more barbaric, heathenish, and motley set than any of the tame merchant ship companies which my previous experiences had made me acquainted with, still I ascribed this, and rightly ascribed it, to the fierce uniqueness of the very nature of that wild Scandinavian vocation in which I had so abandonedly embarked. But it was especially the aspect of the three chief officers of the ship, the mates, which was most forcibly calculated to allay these colorless misgivings and induce confidence and cheerfulness in every presentiment of the voyage. Three better, more likely sea officers and men, each in his own different way, could not readily be found, and they were every one of them Americans, a Nantucketer, a Vineyarder, a Cape man. Now, it being Christmas, when the ship shot out from her harbor, for a space we had biting polar weather, though all the time running away from it to the southward, and by every degree and minute of latitude which we sailed, gradually leaving that merciless winter and all its intolerable weather behind us. It was one of those less lowering, but still gray and gloomy enough mornings of the transition, when with a fair wind of the ship when with a fair wind the ship was rushing through the water with a vindictive sort of leaping and melancholy rapidity, that as I mounted to the deck at the call of the forenoon watch, as soon as I leveled my glance toward the taffrail, foreboding shivers ran over me. Reality outran apprehension. Captain Ahab stood upon his quarter-deck. There seemed no sign of common bodily illness about him, nor of the recovery from any. He looked like a man cut away from the stake when the fire has overrunningly wasted all the limbs without consuming them, or taking away one particle from their aged robustness. His whole high, broad form seemed made of solid bronze, and shaped in an unalterable mold like Cellini's cast Perseus, threading its way out from among his gray hairs and continuing right down one side of his tawny, scorched face and neck till it disappeared in his clothing. You saw a slender, rod-like mark, lividly whitish. It resembled that perpendicular seam sometimes made in the straight, lofty trunk of a great tree when the upper lightning tearingly darts down it, and without wrenching a single twig, peels and grooves out the bark from top to bottom, air running off into the soil, leaving the tree still greenly alive, but branded. Whether that mark was born with him, or whether it was a scar left by some desperate wound, no one could certainly say. By some tacit consent, throughout the voyage, little or no allusion was made to it, especially by the mates. But once Tashtego's senior, an old gay-head Indian among the crew, superstitiously asserted that not till he was full 40 years old did Ahab become that way branded. And then it came upon him, not in the fury of any mortal fray, but in an elemental strife at sea. Yet this wild hint seemed inferentially negatived by what a gray Manxman insinuated, an old sepulchral man, who, having never before sailed out of Nantucket, had never ere this laid eye upon wild Ahab. Nevertheless, the old sea traditions, the immemorial credulities, popularly invested this old Manxman with preternatural powers of discernment, so that no white sailor seriously contradicted him when he said that if ever Captain Ahab should be tranquilly laid out, which might hardly come to pass, so he muttered, then whoever should do that last office for the dead would find a birthmark on him from crown to sole. So powerfully did the whole grim aspect of Ahab affect me, and the livid brand which streaked it, that for the first few moments I hardly noted that not a little of his overbearing grimness was owing to the barbaric white leg upon which he partly stood. It had previously come to me that this ivory leg had at sea been fashioned from the polished bone of the sperm whale's jaw. "Aye, he was demasted off Japan," said the old gay-head Indian once, "but like his demasted craft, he shipped another mast without coming home for it. He has a quiver of 'em." I was struck with the singular posture he maintained. Upon each side of the Pequod's quarter-deck, and pretty close to the mizzen shrouds, there was an auger hole, bored about half an inch or so into the plank. His bone legs steadied in that hole, one arm elevated and holding by a shroud. Captain Ahab stood erect, looking straight out beyond the ship's ever-pitching prow. There was an infinity of firmest fortitude, a determinate, unsurrenderable willfulness in the fixed and fearless forward dedication of that glance. Not a word he spoke, nor did his officers say aught to him, though by all their minutest gestures and expressions they plainly showed the uneasy, if not painful, conscientiousness of being under a troubled master eye. And not only that, but moody, stricken Ahab stood before them with a crucifixion in his face, in all the nameless, regal, overbearing dignity of some mighty woe. Ere long, from his first visit in the air, he withdrew into his cabin. But after that morning, he was every day visible to the crew, either standing in his pivot hole, or seated upon an ivory stool he had, or heavily walking the deck. As the sky grew less gloomy, indeed began to grow a little genial, he became still less and less a recluse, as if, when the ship had sailed from home, nothing but the dead, wintry bleakness of the sea had then kept him so secluded. And by it came to pass that he was almost continually in the air. But as yet, for all that he said, or perceptibly did, on the at last sunny deck, he seemed as unnecessary there as another mast. But the Pequod was only making a passage now, not regularly cruising. Nearly all whaling preparatives needing supervision the mates were fully competent to, so that there was little or nothing out of himself to employ or excite Ahab now, and thus chase away for that one interval the clouds that layer upon layer were piled upon his brow, as ever all clouds choose the loftiest peaks to pile themselves upon. Nevertheless, ere long, the warm, warbling persuasiveness of the pleasant holiday weather we came to seemed gradually to charm him from his mood. For as when the red-cheeked dancing girls, April and May, trip home to the wintry, misanthropic woods, even the barest, ruggedest, most thunder-cloven old oak will at least send forth some few green sprouts to welcome such glad-hearted visitants. So Ahab did, in the end, a little respond to the playful allurings of that girlish air. More than once did he put forth the faint blossom of a look, which in any other man would have soon flowered out in a smile. All right, that was chapter 28. Good deal. Well, I will stop there for tonight. And again, sorry for the bad camera, but the sound is all we care about. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you have a great night, and I'll talk to you soon.